Take my books away. Huh? Take my books away. No. What am I going to do during the shift? Okay, Erev Tov, everyone. So last night we're talking about why you cannot count Jews, and looked at some of them Farshim and some of the maybe philosophical understanding behind the prohibition. What comes out very clearly, the beginning of our parsha, is that a census is taken, but it's done in such a way that everybody gives the kofer nefesh, gives the machatzita shekel, and in that way you can count, or Hashem can count, indirectly can count the people. So in our generation, there is a very fraught and controversial halachic issue, contemporary expression of this, which is taking a census. Taking a census when the state of Israel was formed and when they first started taking these censuses, it was a very, as I say, very, very controversial. And we find poskim with different opinions. It's very interesting. One of the very interesting things that comes out of this discussion that may be is that because there are those that are machmir and who will say not to take part in the census, that may actually be a reason for others to be makel, because we know there are people who won't be taking part. Therefore, we may be able to take part. But anyway, we'll get to that. So, first of all, we saw the psukim yesterday. The Gemara in Yomah talks about this. It says it's in the context of, again, from a very different place, but it's talking about the pais that was done in the Beit HaMikdash. We know that in the Beit HaMikdash there were certain lotteries which were taken in terms of which kohanim would perform which avodah. There were certain avodot which nobody wanted to do, certain avodot which everybody wanted to do. The famous story in the Gemara that originally, right, the Trumat HaDeshen in the morning, originally whichever kohen would come first would be able to do it. And then what happens, says the Mishnah, that they would run up the ramp and whoever got there first could do it. So they were going like that. And it once happened, says the Mishnah, that there were two kohanim running up the ramp and one pushed the other so that he could get there first. The Gemara, by the way, tells a much worse version of that story. It says the two were running up and one pulled out a knife and he stabbed him in order to be the first. Right, we talk about the importance of having balance. Okay. In any event, but then it was established that this was not a good system, and they would take a lottery. Anyway, there were different lotteries which were done in Yom Kippur throughout the year. And how would they take the lottery? They didn't give people tickets with numbers, but what they did, all the kohanim would stand there, and they would choose a number. There would be a very high number, and all the kohanim would put out their fingers, one or two, and you would go, and they would go around and they would count the fingers. And when they got to the number, which was it, that would be the one who would do the avodah. But the Gemara brings this, and one of the things the Gemara learns from this is that when you count, you can't count directly. You don't, because you're not counting the kohanim, you're counting the fingers, you're counting an indirect count. And then the Gemara gets into a discussion. It says we have the psukim in Sefer Hosea, mentioned the psukim in Kitisa, but also in Hosea it says in the Navi, it says Bnei Israel will be like Kechol Hayam, asher lo yimad v'lo yisafer. Will be like the dust of the earth, like the sand on the beaches, right? Which cannot be counted. Two different ways it says cannot be counted. So two different opinions in the Gemara. Is there, when you count Jews, do you transgress one opinion? Do you transgress one prohibition because it says Asher lo yimad? Or do you transgress two different prohibitions because it says Asher lo yimad v'lo yisafer? Either way. And then the Gemara says, well, actually there's a contradiction in the pasuk, because it starts off, it says will be kechol hayam. Now, Chol Hayam is very difficult to count because there's a lot of it, but it's not infinite. It could be counted, which cannot be counted. So the Gemara says two resolutions. Either the difference is when we are sin ratzon makom, when lo sin ratzon makom. In other words, how numerous the Jewish people will be depends on how we're behaving. And the second answer it gives, second resolution, it says, one is bidei Adam and one is bidei Shammai. In other words, we can't count, but in Shemaim they can count. Okay, but in any way, what comes out of that Gemara is that there's a prohibition to count, but the source for the prohibition is not from the Parsha Kitisa. The source of the prohibition is in the Navi in Hosea. So Rav Shaul Yisraeli says the following. This is how he learns out different opinions, Rishonim, Achronim, but Rav Yisraeli learns out the following. He says there are two separate prohibitions that we have. Says there is one prohibition in terms of counting the entire Jewish people, and that is a prohibition that can never be waived, except for the case of the machatzita shekel. That's the only way that the entire Jewish people can be counted. He says, if you're counting less than the entire Jewish people, we mentioned yesterday, you want to count how many people you have for a minyan, how many people, whatever it is, you're counting a segment. So that's why it says, lo yimad v'lo yisafer. So you cannot count directly, but any form of indirect counting over there, he says, would be enough. So he says, if you want to count the entire Jewish people, even if it's indirect, that's not good enough. That's only kofer nefesh, that's only machatzit hashem. But counting a smaller portion, where it's not the entire people, that's okay. What's considered indirect counting? If you write all the names on a piece of paper, and then you count up the pieces of paper, you count up the names. So there's a big, Chatam Sofer has a discussion. He's not convinced that counts as indirect enough, and be that as it may. So then the question comes when it came to the census, when they started doing the census in the 1950s, 60s, etc. Can you participate, or should you participate, or what's the? So the Sri Daesh, Rav Weinberg says there's no problem to participate. He says, again, based on the Rishonim and based on the Sugya, he says, first of all, there's a need for it. That's the first thing. One of the opinions in the Rishonim is that if you're counting, there's no need, you're counting just for the sake of it, that's not acceptable, even if it's indirect. But if you're counting, there's a need for economic planning, for security planning. I don't know what they do with the numbers, but he says that it's necessary to have those numbers, and it's done in an indirect way. So he thinks that that's okay. And he says, therefore, you can participate, and that's fine. Rabbi Israeli comes along and he extends what he said. He says, if we're counting the entire Jewish people, that is a problem. But whenever you're counting less than the entire Jewish people, that's okay. And he says over here, you're counting the population that's living in Israel. Now, it's a big discussion throughout, and it comes up in many different places. Do we consider the Jews living in Eretz Israel as all of, in a halachic sense, is that considered the entire Jewish people? Obviously, we know that there are other people living elsewhere. Where do we see this? We see this in the Rambam, for example, when it comes to Halacha of Smicha. He says that we only consider the Jews that are living in Israel. We don't consider those who are living elsewhere. And therefore, in a certain, it also comes up by certain korbanot. So in a certain halachic sense, there are certain halachot where we're only concerned about those that are living here. Another place where this comes up, there's a sugya of saying halal on Yom Ha'atzmaut or not. So a big sugya, lots of different questions I'm not going into now. But one of the factors that's brought, there are poskim who say that halal can only be said on a nes, on a miracle that took place, which affected the entire Jewish people. Now, especially now, since October 7th, it's very difficult to argue that the establishment of the State of Israel was not something that, that affected in a positive way the entire Jewish people. But even if you wanted to say, and if you wanted to take on a stretch on a literal level and say that halal, that Yom Ha'atzmaut, we're looking at what happened in the War of Independence, and we're only looking at those who are living here, who are under direct threat in that war, etc. There is a halachic argument to say, nonetheless, when it comes to halal, when it comes to these questions, we consider the majority, or we consider the entirety of the Jewish people in a halachic sense. We only look at those living in Israel. We don't look at those in Chutz La'aretz. But Rav Israeli says over here, we don't say that. We don't need to say that, because that's in a halachic sense. But in a real sense, the fact is there are millions of Jews that are not here. When we're counting, we go by the Metziut. He says in the same way that we don't say that the Yovel year doesn't apply nowadays in our times, because we don't have the majority of the Jewish people living in Israel. You said we only look at who's living in Israel. No, in order to count, in order to know the majority of the Jews in the world, do they live in Israel or not, we have to look at all the Jews in the world. Same thing, he says, when it comes to the census, you look at, if we're counting all the Jews in the world, so here we're not counting all the Jews in the world, and therefore it's more lenient, and therefore he has no qualms about participating and taking place in the census. Somebody who was very, very opposed to this was the Steipler. And the Steipler, there's a number of letters, it's interesting, because different censuses which took place. So in the 1961, he writes a letter, and he's somewhat ambivalent about it. He says, again, they're doing a census, you're counting, it comes from a different angle. He says, a lot of the people that are being counted in this count are not halachically Jewish. There might be people that are from conversions that are questionable, or other things. And what? Right. Nowadays, the proportion is a lot more, maybe even then. Okay. So he says, therefore, you might say that. At the end of the day, he rejects it. He's not willing to rely on it, because at the end of the day, he says you are still counting all the Jewish people amongst that. And 10 years later, when they had another census, or 11 years later, 1972, he comes out and he's very, very machmir. He writes the following. He says, "Bi'amim ha'krovim omdim lesader monim she'imnu et Yisrael v'yesh lizaher shelo la'anot lehem klum." When they come knocking on the door, giving you the form, he says, don't answer. He says, tell them it's forbidden. He says there's a chashash concern, quotes the Gemara, quotes the Rishonim, etc. He says, etc. And then there's a second part of the letter. You see, things haven't changed. He says, it's come to my attention that some of these people are they're getting the form for the census, and they've come along and they've said, here's the form and here's the census. And the stipler said that you can fill in the form. You can, his psak is that it's okay to participate. So this was brought to his attention. And he says, there are those who said, המפקידים את התושבים, מגידים בשמי, שראיתי כי מותר למסור לכתוב שמות האנשים. He says, they said, I said you could fill in the names. He says, כל זה שקר גמור ודאי. This is a lie, I never said such a thing. ודאי אסור למסור לכתוב את שמות האנשים מקצתן או כולן, הכל בכלל האיסור של מוני ישראל, והכל בכלל סכנה של נגף חס וחלילה. Okay, so he's very, very opposed to that, right? But there are others who say the Shevet HaLevi, as well, Rav Wozner, much later on in the 1990s, he came out, he said, similar to Rav Israeli, he says, at the end of the day, the count, we mentioned before, you're counting the Jewish people that are here, and you're not counting the Jewish people in Chutz La'aretz. But again, the count even of the population of Israel is not just Jews. There are many, there are Christians, and there are Arabs, and etc. So you're counting the population, but you're not counting the Jews specifically. And therefore, he says that's okay, even though afterwards you'll take from the count and you ask people, are they Jewish? And you'll take out the numbers. Oh, that's done by computer. It's done indirectly. It's done later on. And therefore, he's not concerned about that. One other point. Zorav Belsky had a tshuva regarding doing the census in America. So this is another one of these questions which in Chutz La'aretz, it's much easier because there, by definition, the count is not just there are Jews amongst them, but you're counting from the population. And even though he says, even though they have a box for religion, you can tick, so you'll say you're counting Jews. Well, not everybody fills in the box. They leave it optional. Not everybody has to say. And therefore, he's lenient about that. So at the end of the day, again, and there are other opinions back and forth. Rav Goren, it might surprise you to hear that he was actually opposed. He thought it was problematic, but nonetheless, many poskim say, for the reasons we've discussed, and for others, that it's okay. One is allowed to participate in the census. And what I mentioned at the beginning as well, since there are poskim who say that you can't take part, so by definition, it's never going to be counting everybody. So there's always going to be people that are left out, and that would be another reason to believe. Rabbi Hanania ben Akash Omer, Sakadosh Baruch Hu, Zagot Yisrael. כך כבר למצוא מצוות שני אמרת לך וצמן צדקו יגדיר תורה וידע.